Okay, we had a comment, and I felt like this explains why I want to share a little bit more about this this Greek, Roman Greco worldview. But she said comments of she said studying the cycles of life for things that happen in our life and the attention and the time and the effort we give to being comfortable so that we can have the settled feeling. And I think the Lord puts things into our path in a loving way to say, hey, you can't be settled and you're not going to grow. And how the conflict within ourselves is sometimes sometimes we just want to be settled and we're tired of trying, but we know that we need to, and it's just a distraction, and trying to find things that will still support that distraction when we know we should be focusing on growth. And I loved that. And I wanted to add to that comment because everything about this ego in us, where we're seeking our own call and without relying on heaven above, as we talked about yesterday, is all this description is in the word, in the scriptures. And I'm giving this idea of our ego and the desires of our natural man, I'm giving that this name of hero. And I don't mean that if you label something as a hero, it's bad. I'm just showing it's an opposite name because, as I'm showing here, the hero represents this Roman Greco worldview. And it's usually in opposition to the Hebraic worldview, because in the original Bible culture was in that Palestine area of the Hebrews. And there was the Roman and the Greeks were the world powers at the time of Christ's birth and things. And at that time, even before Christ's birth, there was these competing empires. You have the Egyptian and the Syrians, and it was one time or another. But at the time when the Greek Roman Empire started, it was the Greek Empire started, it started to counterfeit the Hebrew culture. Those philosophers or leaders received this great enlightenment from the Hebrew prophets that were coming out of the Palestine area to Turkey and Greece. And as they were dispersing, as those people were dispersing and going out, even 600 years before Christ, at that time frame when these prophets came, they were dressed up in their robes and they were teaching this really great enlightenment that we know now as what the prophets were teaching the Bible, and of a higher way. The Greek philosophers received them, listened to them, and loved what they were learning. And they saw this great enlightenment and the light that was with these prophets. And when the prophets stopped coming, because possibly they were killed, or all of the house of Israel that was left there in the Palestine area were destroyed, 90% of them were killed or taken, the rest were taken away. And we see a real abrupt change in that culture. So when these prophets stopped coming with this enlightenment, the Greek philosophers and those at the time, they started to mimic those teachings. And there was an effect from what was taught. It was transferred. But so you see this Greek enlightenment started around the time as when the Hebrew prophets disappeared from Jerusalem. And when the people were taken out of that area, really what happened was the truths that were coming from heaven above through those people and through those prophets and through that birthright and that family was teaching those people in the Palestine area, and then out to the world was now gone. But it started to be transferred from that Eastern and Oriental place, which the Palestine area was more on the Eastern side, to the Western. It went to the Roman Greco worldview, and this expansion to the West is just describing where the people left, where the world powers how that world power changed the world and this birth of the West. And that began the Western Occidental worldview. And it was around the time of Christ. And from there, it turned into the Roman Catholic Empire. And Paul taught us that this was the beginning of the time of the Gentiles, when we can see this Greek Roman inheritance and the worldview that highly influenced our world today. So Christianity did spread, and the parts of truth were dispersed. And from what I understand, that is also called the time of the great apostasy, when truth was denied to the people and they chose not to follow God's ways and not to follow the instructions that were given from their original inheritances and such. And their leadership ended up killing Christ. With that situation that people were in, Paul and Peter and all of their different prophets were dispersed, and these prophets were killed. My understanding is that the full truth was gone. So we end up inheriting much of this Roman Greco worldview. And the Reformists and the Pilgrims and then the founders of America restored much of these original Hebrew ways and inheritance through the original style of education that they showed us. And their Judeo-Christian worldview reflects much of the original Hebraic culture. It just has to be investigated and observed and explored and seen. So this is just some of our history into how the West, with the Greek philosophers and leadership, influenced our culture. And there is a book sharing about how the Greek story of all of their gods were representing the original gods. They deliberately changed the original stories to represent a set of counterfeit gods. So Zeus and Hera, instead of Adam and Eve, were the first couple, quote unquote, in Genesis. When I had read about the Greek gods, I always wondered, what is that really about? And I studied and explored and discovered this principle outside of any of this ancient Hebrew. But later, when I connected this law with that Sun Horizon pictograph, I was able to fill in the story and make connections that I share here. And now I would like to shift slightly and examine some lessons we can apply as we view our own story in this universal law.